This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that keeps promising control while quietly surrendering it. A system that speaks in confidence, but moves on assumptions that no longer hold. You were told power looks like access. You were told leverage looks like authority. What you were not told is that markets do not listen to speeches. They listen to math. And right now, the math is drifting away from the people who think they're in charge. What's dangerous here is not the decision itself. It's the belief underneath it. The belief that you can step into a broken machine, turn a few dials, and restart the engine. As if time, risk, capital, and gravity are optional. If you've ever wondered why big promises keep shrinking after they're made, stay with me. If you want to understand why confidence keeps outrunning reality, this matters. Because once you see how this system actually moves, you can't unsee it. And what comes next is where the real tension begins. What actually runs this system now is not who you think. It is not the people giving orders. It is not the people giving interviews. It is not even the people who believe they're steering. The system is governed by a quieter authority, capital return timelines, risk tolerance, and the brutal distinction between money already spent and money still exposed. This is the part that rarely makes it into public language because it doesn't sound powerful. It sounds procedural, but it decides everything. In this system, influence belongs to whoever can say no the longest, whoever can wait, whoever can walk away. That's why promises sound bold at the podium and cautious in the boardroom. That's why enthusiasm evaporates the moment spreadsheets open. Not because people change their minds, but because the system never agreed in the first place. You were told control comes from ownership. But ownership without return is just liability. And the tension builds here, because when political timelines collide with capital timelines, something always gives. The question is not whether the system will push back, it's where, and that brings us to the shift that made this collision inevitable. There was a time when this system moved slowly on purpose. Long horizons, decades, not quarters. Investments that assumed patience, stability, and predictability. That time is gone. What replaced it didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived quietly, one adjustment at a time. Shorter cycles, faster payback, less tolerance for waiting. Before, risk was something you absorbed over time. Now, risk is something you avoid entirely or offload onto someone else. This shift was framed as efficiency, as discipline, as maturity, but it changed the rules without ever saying so. Because when a system retrains itself to demand returns quickly, it stops believing in long stories. It stops funding slow repairs. It stops trusting promises that require patience. And the most dangerous part, nothing broke immediately. The lights stayed on. The flows continued. The language stayed confident. But underneath, the system learned how to say no to projects that take too long, to environments that can't guarantee safety, to plans built on hope instead of margins. This is how pressure builds without noise. This is how instability becomes normal. And once you see that shift, the first visible crack makes sense. Then the shock arrives, not as a collapse, as a promise that sounds decisive, fast, confident. Production can be restored. Output can be raised. Supply can be moved. On paper, it looks like momentum. In reality, it's a stress test. Because when you slow this down just slightly, you see the problem. The numbers don't scale. The timelines don't match. The gains are incremental in a system that requires magnitude. Small increases are presented as turning points. Months are treated like years, and complexity is compressed into slogans. This is not failure yet. It's something more revealing. It's a system responding to pressure by lowering the bar for what counts as success, by celebrating motion instead of outcome, by treating marginal change as structural repair. If you're listening closely, you can hear the recalibration happening in real time. Expectations shrinking, language softening, claims becoming conditional. If this feels familiar, it should. You've seen this pattern before. In other industries, in other moments, right before the limits assert themselves. Stay with me, because what looks like progress here is actually a signal, and the signal points to a mechanism most people never get to see. Here's the mechanism, and once you see it, the story stops sounding optimistic. There are two kinds of costs in this system. The costs already paid, and the costs no one wants to admit are still coming. When capital is sunk, production continues, even if it barely makes sense, because stopping would mean acknowledging loss. But when capital is still exposed, everything changes. That's where power actually lives. In the decision not to commit, this system rewards projects that can be entered and exited quickly, that return cash before conditions change, that don't depend on stability lasting longer than a few quarters. What doesn't fit that profile gets filtered out. Not loudly. Quietly, through delayed approvals, through further study, through risk committees that never quite align. And here's the imbalance. When things go right, returns are captured privately. When things go wrong, the damage spreads outward. To workers, to consumers, to governments left holding expectations they can't enforce. This is why confidence can coexist with hesitation. Why public enthusiasm doesn't translate into private commitment. The system is doing exactly what it was trained to do. Protect capital first, absorb pressure later, and that works. Until pressure stops being theoretical. Because the next moment isn't about mechanism, it's about acceleration. Now it speeds up. Statements multiply, meetings stack, deadlines blur. Teams are sent to evaluate, not to commit. Language shifts from will to could, from when to if. Prices move, then stall. Expectations spike, then recalibrate. Nothing dramatic happens. And that's the warning, because acceleration doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like motion without traction, like activity that never quite converts into outcome. In this phase, everyone stays technically correct. No promises are broken. No lines are crossed. But momentum is quietly leaking away. Short-term signals are mistaken for long-term change. Temporary shifts are framed as reversals, and the system keeps advancing headlines faster than fundamentals. This is where fragility hides best, not in collapse. In drift, you can feel it in the shortening timeframes. The hedged language. The urgency to announce before proving, and then comes the moment that changes the tone entirely. Not because something fails, but because someone finally asks, who is absorbing the risk? That question doesn't get answered yet. But once it's asked, the system can't unhear it. This is where it reaches you. Not as a headline, as a constraint. Because when capital hesitates, costs don't disappear. They relocate, they show up as delayed hiring, as higher prices justified by uncertainty, as infrastructure that stays half repaired because no one wants to be last in. You feel it when promises don't turn into jobs. When volatility becomes a reason, everything is provisional. When the language of risk management quietly governs your options, you're told patience is required, that these things take time. But the waiting is not evenly distributed. Some people wait with buffers, others wait with bills. And this is the part rarely acknowledged. The system's discipline is experienced as instability on the ground. Its caution translates into precarity. Its flexibility becomes your exposure. If this feels abstract, it's because it's designed to be. Distance protects decision makers from consequence. But stay with me, because once enough people feel this mismatch, it stops being background noise. That's when systems start to echo. And what begins as an economic posture becomes something much harder to contain. The ripple doesn't stop where it starts. Because this system isn't national, it's networked. Barrels move, capital moves faster, risk moves fastest of all. When one market hesitates, another absorbs. When one promise stalls, another supplier steps in. Not out of loyalty, out of arbitrage. This is how local decisions become global rearrangements. how supply routes bend without breaking, how power migrates without announcement. What looks like leverage in one country becomes opportunity in another. What sounds like pressure here becomes margin somewhere else. And that's the destabilizing part. Because once outcomes are determined elsewhere, control becomes symbolic. Policy turns reactive, timing slips. You see it in rerouted flows, in substitutions that don't quite make headlines, in quiet rebalancing that leaves no clear villain. The system adapts faster than institutions can respond. And adaptation looks like resilience until it isn't, because resilience without accountability accumulates strain. And strain doesn't announce itself globally, it surfaces unevenly through price, through access, through political pressure that doesn't match economic leverage. At this point, the question is no longer who decides. It's how long this mismatch can persist before it forces a choice. And that takes us forward, not to certainty, but to acceleration into the future. From here, the system doesn't resolve. It accelerates, and there are three paths forward. The first is adjustment. Quiet, technocratic. Expectations are lowered to meet reality. Promises become smaller. Timelines stretch. The system absorbs the contradiction by redefining success. Nothing breaks. But nothing truly changes. The second path is erosion. Slower, harder to see. Confidence thins. Trust decays. Each gap between announcement and outcome becomes easier to ignore until it isn't. Institutions keep functioning, but legitimacy leaks out through repetition. People stop listening before anyone notices. And then there is rupture. Not inevitable, but possible. This happens when political urgency collides with economic refusal, when pressure can no longer be deferred, when someone is forced to absorb a loss that was never priced in. None of these paths announce themselves in advance. They overlap. They blur. They can even coexist for a while. What matters is that the system is already moving, not toward a decision, but toward a reckoning with limits. And that brings us to the most dangerous moment, not the outcome, but the point just before it becomes unavoidable. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable, because nothing here ends cleanly. There is no reset button, no decisive moment where the system admits what it can't do. What happens instead is quieter. The language keeps promising control. The structure keeps avoiding commitment, and the gap between the two becomes normal. That normalization is the danger. When systems survive by lowering expectations rather than solving constraints, they train everyone to accept less clarity, less accountability, less truth. Not all at once. Just enough to function. And that's how power drifts. Not through takeover, through assumption, through the belief that things are being handled somewhere, by someone, even when the math says otherwise. If you've stayed with me this far, you already feel it. The tension isn't about oil or markets or politics. It's about what happens when decision makers speak in narratives while reality responds in numbers. This story isn't finished. It's unfolding slowly, deliberately, in places most cameras don't linger. If you want to understand where this leads before it becomes obvious, stay curious. Stay skeptical. And don't look away when confidence outruns capacity. Because the most dangerous systems don't fail loudly. They persist until they can't. If you want to go deeper, this is where the next chapter begins.